there is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a city at the end of a long day. Not silence, exactly, more like a softening. The way sounds that were sharp and bright in the afternoon begin to round at their edges, to blend into one another, to become something more like a low hum than a collection of separate things. It is a good kind of quiet, a comfortable one. And it is exactly this kind of quiet that is beginning, right now, to settle over the city of Rome. The time is somewhere in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era. The city is large, larger than almost anyone alive has ever seen or imagined a city could be. Close to 1 million people have made their lives here, in these streets and alleyways and apartment buildings, stacked 4 and 5 stories high, in the gardens and the market squares, and the long colonnaded walkways that run between the public buildings. It is a city that has been growing for centuries, and it shows. Old temples stand beside newer ones. Ancient cobblestones have been worn smooth by generations of feet. The stone itself seems to carry the warmth of all those years inside it. And now, at the end of this particular afternoon, the sun is dropping behind the Capitoline Hill. The Capitoline is one of the 7 hills of Rome, and it rises on the western edge of the Forum, broad and solid, and covered near its summit with the great temples that look out over the whole city. The temple of Jupiter best and greatest stands up there, white and enormous, its columns catching the last of the day's light. And as the sun moves behind the hill, the shadow begins to fall. It comes slowly, as shadows from hills always do. First, it reaches the far edge of the Forum below, touching the stones there with a cooler shade. Then, it moves across the open space of the square itself, sliding over the paving stones with the unhurried patience of something that has been doing this every evening for hundreds of years. The Forum is beginning to empty out. It has been a busy place all day, as it always is. The Forum Romanum, the Roman Forum, is the heart of the city in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. It is where courts have been held, where speeches have been given, where elections have been announced, and triumphs celebrated, and laws debated for generation after generation. During the daylight hours, it fills up with people, with lawyers and merchants and philosophers, and idlers and priests and senators, and simply ordinary people who have come to conduct whatever small piece of business requires conducting in the center of things. But now the courts are done for the day. The advocates have gathered their scrolls and their notes and gone home, or to the baths, which is perhaps the same thing in a different order. The crowds that gathered to listen to the speeches in the open air have dispersed into the side streets. The Forum is still not empty. Rome is never quite empty, but it is quieter now than it has been since early this morning. Along the Via Sacra, which is the sacred way, the main road that runs through the Forum itself, the shopkeepers are beginning to close up for the evening. The Via Sacra is lined on both sides with small shops, many of them tucked into the bases of the larger buildings, their fronts open to the street during the day, their counters stretching out toward the passing foot traffic. Some of these shops sell luxury goods. There are jewelers here, and sellers of fine cloth, and merchants who deal in perfumes and spices brought up from the docks along the river. During the day, these shops are bright and busy, their wares displayed to catch the eye of anyone who walks past. But now the merchants are bringing things in. Long wooden shutters are being lifted into place across the open fronts of the shops. Bolts of fabric are being carried back from the counters into the shadowed storage rooms behind. A jeweler, working carefully in the last of the good light, wraps a tray of rings and brooches in a soft cloth and sets them in a wooden box. He does this slowly and methodically because he has done it every evening for many years, and because the things he is wrapping are valuable, and because there is no particular hurry anymore now that the customers are gone. Nearby, a merchant who has spent the day selling oil sits at his counter with a small wooden tablet and a stylus making marks in the wax to record what he has sold and what he is owed and what he owes in return. The numbers are not very dramatic. It has been an ordinary day, not a particularly good one or a particularly bad one. He makes his marks in the wax with the same careful attention he would give to any other day, folds the tablet closed, and sets it beside him. The light across the stone pavement of the Via Sacra is doing something remarkable right now. It has turned amber, deep amber, the color of old honey, and it stretches out in long, thin lines across the worn surface of the road, following the slight irregularities in the stone, pooling in the shallow grooves between the individual blocks. The pavement of the Via Sacra is very old. Some of these stones were laid centuries before this particular evening, and the feet of the entire long history of the Roman Republic and the early empire have passed over them. They have a smoothness to them that only comes from that kind of time. And in this amber light, that smoothness looks almost like something precious, almost like the surface of still water. The columns of the temples around the forum are catching this light as well. The Temple of Saturn stands near the far end of the forum, and its columns glow a warm reddish gold in the last of the sun. The Temple of Castor and Pollux, with its 3 tall columns that are among the most recognizable shapes in the whole city, takes on a color that is almost rose. The buildings of Rome are not all white, as they are sometimes imagined to be. Many of them are painted in red and yellow and ochre and blue, and some of that paint shows now in the late light, adding to the warmth of the scene. A cat picks its way carefully along the base of one of the temple platforms, stepping delicately over the uneven edge where the stone meets the ground. Cats are common in Rome. They are tolerated and often welcomed in homes and warehouses and shops because they keep the grain stores free of mice. This one is not affiliated with any particular household at the moment. It is simply moving through the evening as cats do, following some private itinerary that has nothing to do with the concerns of people. The shadows have deepened now. The long amber light is going. It is not going quickly. This is not the sudden darkness of the tropics, but it is going steadily. the way light always goes in this part of the world in the evening, pulling back gradually from the stones and the columns and the worn faces of the buildings until the color has drained away, and what remains is a softer, grayer, more general kind of illumination. The sky above the Forum is still bright, still holding the last blue of the day, but the streets and the spaces between the buildings have already moved into the first real shade of evening. This hour, this last hour of light, has been a familiar thing to Romans for as long as there have been Romans in this city. The Latin word for it, the time around sunset, was a part of the daily structure of life here, one of 12 unequal hours that divided the day from sunrise to sunset and shifted in length with the seasons. The hours themselves are longer in summer and shorter in winter because they are always 1/12 of the available daylight, however much or little daylight there happens to be. This evening in our imagined visit is a mild one. Not the longest day of the year, not the shortest. Somewhere in between, when the hours are of a comfortable middle length, and the evening comes neither too early nor too late. And the evening is coming now. The last merchants are folding their awnings. These are the large fabric canopies that were stretched out over the fronts of the shops during the day to keep the sun from the goods and the customers, and they are made of heavy cloth, striped sometimes in faded colors. Folding them is a particular kind of work. It requires a certain attention to get the folds even, to keep the cloth off the ground, to wrap the thing properly, so it can be unrolled again in the morning without trouble. 2 assistants at one of the larger fabric stalls are doing this together now, working in practiced coordination, neither of them needing to say much. They have done this particular thing many times before. The Forum is settling into its evening quiet. The stones are warm still, holding the heat of the long day's sun in the way that stone always does, releasing it slowly into the cooling air. If a hand were placed flat against one of the paving stones right now, it would feel that warmth, faint but real, like the warmth that lingers in a room after a fire has been banked down to coals. Rome is moving into the night, not rushing toward it, not dreading it, simply settling into it, the way a city that is very old and very large settles into the end of every ordinary day, with a long, comfortable, unhurried breath. The wooden panels are heavy. That is perhaps the first thing to notice if you are standing quietly at the edge of one of Rome's long, narrow streets as the light continued to soften and settle. The panels that close the tabernae, the small open-fronted shops built into the ground floors of nearly every building along nearly every Roman street. Those panels are thick and solid, cut from dense timber, and they slide into stone grooves worn glassy smooth by years and years of the same motion, morning and evening, until the stone itself remembers the shape of them. A shopkeeper would lift them one by one and slot them carefully into place, the base of each panel resting in its groove first, then the top tilting inward and dropping into the upper channel with a low, familiar sound. Not a slam, not a crash, just a settling. A dull, soft thud that meant the day was over and the shop had said what it needed to say. Along most Roman streets, the tabernae sat shoulder to shoulder, their wide, open fronts giving onto the pavement, with almost no separation between the inside of the shop and the world outside. During the busier hours of the day, all of that openness would have been full of sound and movement. The voices of sellers, the clatter of goods being shifted, the smell of things warming and things cooling, the press of people moving through. But as the afternoon had given way to early evening, that energy had been gradually drawing in, like breath being slowly let out. The wine cellars were among those who closed with a kind of quiet ceremony. Amphorae, the tall, two-handled clay jars that held wine, oil, and other liquids, would be standing in their rows, their pointed bases resting in sand or in small holes cut into the countertop to hold them upright. As the evening came on, the seller would press stoppers of cork or cloth into the narrow necks, sometimes sealing them with a smear of resin or wax, and the sharp, warm smell of wine that had been breathing all day would gradually recede as each jar was closed. The smell did not vanish all at once. It stayed in the air for a while, comfortable and slightly sweet, the way certain smells do, holding on to a space even after their source has been put away. Bread had been baked earlier in the day. Rome's pastrina, its bakeries, had been running their stone mills since the deepest hours of the previous night, grinding grain into flour while the streets were still quiet, then shaping and baking loaves through the morning so that bread would be available by the time the city's residents were awake and moving. By evening, most of what had been baked was sold or stored, and the wide stone counter of a bakery, which had been warm for so many hours, was now only faintly warm to the touch. A baker closing up for the evening might run a cloth across that counter, a slow and unhurried movement, and the stone would give off the last of its heat quietly into the cooler air coming in off the street. The bread bins, long wooden or clay containers built into or beside the counter, would be sealed with their lids. If any loaves remained, they would rest there through the night in the darkness of the bin, still holding some of the faint warmth of the oven. Not much, just enough to make the wood of the bin feel slightly different from the stone around it. Somewhere on a side street, a cook shop was banking its fire. The Popany and Thermopolia, the small establishments where hot food was served from wide-mouthed clay containers set into the stone counter, heated from below by small fires, those places, too, had their closing rituals. The embers that had kept soups and stews warm through the afternoon would be pressed down and covered, the glow fading from orange to a deep and quiet red, and then dimming further still. The cook might use a long-handled tool to move the coals, and the small sounds of that, the soft scrape, the brief hiss if something damp met the heat, were the sounds of a fire being put gently to rest rather than extinguished dramatically. dramatically. And the smell of frying onions. It is the kind of smell that stays long after the cooking is finished. Oil and onion together, warming in a shallow pan over a small fire, produce a sweetness that seems to work its way into the stone of the walls, the wood of the counter, the air of the street outside. As the fires were banked and the pans were set aside, the smell continued to drift, not strongly, but persistently, the way warmth itself drifts from a surface that has been in the sun for a long afternoon. You could walk past a closed popina on a Roman evening and still know what had been cooking there, still feel the ghost of that warmth in the air around the doorway. The wooden panels of the tabernae continued to go up, one by one, in no particular hurry, in no particular order. A sandal maker 3 doors from a wine cellar, a dyer whose colored cloths had been hanging in the open air all day, a small dealer in lamps and oil, each closed according to their own pace and their own habits. Some shops had a single wide panel, some had several narrower ones that stacked or slid in sequence. Some shopkeepers worked alone, lifting each piece themselves. Others had an assistant who handed up the panels, while the owner checked the interior one last time, making sure nothing was left in a way it shouldn't be. Above the shops, in the upper floors of the same buildings, the insulae Rome's apartment buildings, rose several stories into the evening air. People leaned at windows. A lamp was lit in one room, its small light appearing in a square of shadow. The sounds of the street below were already becoming quieter, and the sounds from inside the buildings were gradually becoming more audible by contrast. A voice, water being poured, the movement of someone crossing a wooden floor. Street itself held its warmth a little longer than the air above it. Rome's paving stones, large, irregular blocks of basalt, hard and dark, had been absorbing sunlight since early morning, and that stored heat was still rising slowly from them now, even as the air above cooled. If you pressed a hand flat against the pavement, the stone would feel faintly warm. The sensation was gentle and easy, like a wall that has been in the afternoon sun, the kind of warmth that seems thoughtful rather than intense. Somewhere a cat moved along the base of a wall, unhurried, following some path only it understood, disappearing into a gap between 2 buildings without any particular sound. The street noise was softer now, in the way that a conversation among several people can soften gradually as the evening draws on, not because anyone has decided to be quiet, but because the natural rhythms of the day are drawing inward. One voice drops away, and then another, and the remaining voices lower themselves almost without meaning to. And eventually, there is only the occasional word, the occasional footstep, and between those things, a kind of comfortable quiet that feels earned rather than imposed. A lamplighter moved along one of the wider streets, tending to the oil lamps that some building owners and some wealthier households kept burning near their doorways through the night. The lamps were small terracotta, rounded, with a narrow spout for the wick, and their flames were not large. Each one made a small circle of warm, slightly orange light against the stone around it, And beyond that circle, the street returned to the quiet blue-gray of a Roman evening. The panels of the tabernae were all, or nearly all, in place now on this particular street, on this particular quiet stretch near the edge of the forum. The wood of the panels had a smell of its own, dry and faintly dusty, the smell of timber that has been outside in the Roman air for several seasons, absorbing the heat of summers, drying out through long dry spells, absorbing again. The stone grooves held the panels firmly. The shops were closed and still. The fires in the cookshops were low and resting. The amphorae were stoppered. The bread bins were sealed. The colored cloths of the dyer had been taken in from the street, where they had hung all day in the warm, moving air. The sandal maker's tools were set aside. What remained was the warmth of the stones, rising slowly and without urgency into the cooling night air. The faint smell of onions and wine and warm wood, still present, but growing more gentle with each passing minute. The small flames of the oil lamps, steady in the still air, and the city breathing, not stopped, not silent, just drawing itself inward a little, the way evenings do, the way the end of a long and busy day does, settling into the quiet that comes after the shutters close and before the next thing begins. By the time the tabernae close and the streets begin their slow quieting, most Romans have already eaten. The main meal of the day, the cena, belongs to the late afternoon, taken while there is still enough light to see by, while the warmth of the day is only just beginning to cool. It is not a late meal, not by the standards of much later centuries. It comes early, and it is finished, and by the time true darkness gathers over the city, the dishes have long since been cleared away. The cena is the meal that matters most. There's a lighter meal in the morning, the intaculum, taken almost in passing. A piece of bread, perhaps with a little olive oil or some olives or a small wedge of cheese. And there is something at midday too, the prandium, simple and unceremoniousness, eaten quickly without much fuss. But the cena is different. The cena is when the household gathers, when the fire in the kitchen is given more attention, when the day begins its long exhale. In an apartment on one of the city's upper floors, or in a modest ground-level room opening onto a courtyard, the evening meal might be something like a pot of lentil porridge, thick and warm, flavored with a little cumin or coriander, perhaps a handful of leeks softened in oil. Lentils are a staple, familiar and filling, the kind of food that has been eaten in this city and in the lands around it for as long as anyone can remember. The pot sits over a small brazier, the coals banked low, the smell rising gently into the room. A piece of bread is torn and dipped. A cup of wine is poured, usually diluted with water, as Romans almost always drink it, the wine thinned to something soft and easy, nothing that demands attention. This is how most people eat, simply, without ceremony, without many dishes. The household slaves, where there are any, eat something similar, often the same thing, sometimes a little less. The family eats together in the main room, or perhaps just in whatever space is available, which in a city this crowded can mean a room that serves several purposes at once. The lamp is lit. The voices are quiet. There is a certain contentment in it, the kind that comes from hunger satisfied and the work of the day behind. Across the city, in a very different room, the scene looks entirely unlike this. In the homes of the wealthy, the dining room is called the triclinium, named for the 3 couches arranged around a central table. The word itself simply meaning 3 couches in Greek, a reminder of how much Roman culture owes to the world that came before it. Diners recline on these couches, leaning on their left sides, eating with their right hands. They do not sit upright at a table the way many later peoples will. They lie propped on cushions, comfortable, at ease, the body allowed to settle into the meal rather than hold itself upright against it. Reclining to eat is a sign that there is no hurry, that the evening belongs to this. A wealthy cena might begin with the gustatio, a course of starters, eggs, olives, salted fish, small vegetables dressed with vinegar. These are eaten while conversation begins, while the wine is brought out in its diluted, sociable form. Then the main courses arrive, one after another, sometimes 3, sometimes more, brought by household slaves moving quietly through the room. One of the dishes that appears in wealthy Roman households with some regularity is the roasted dormouse, the gleis, a small woodland creature fattened in ceramic jars called glauraria, kept in the dark and fed on walnuts and acorns until they are round and sleepy and ready. They are roasted and served with honey and poppy seeds, something sweet and unusual, a delicacy that signals abundance without needing to announce it loudly. The dormouse is not an everyday food, not even for the rich. It is the kind of thing that appears at dinner parties, at meals where the host wishes to offer something memorable. It sits on its dish, small and honey glazed, and the guests reach for it without ceremony, as though this is perfectly ordinary. Honeyed wine comes with the meal, or after it, mulsum they call it, wine mixed with honey before fermentation is complete, or sometimes just sweetened afterward. The result is warm and faintly floral, easy to drink in slow sips while the conversation drifts. Wine at a wealthy Roman table is often named, often brought from specific regions, from the slopes of Vesuvius, from the islands off the coast, from vineyards in southern Italy, where the volcanic soil gives the grapes something particular. The host might mention where a wine comes from. The guests might nod in appreciation, but underneath nearly every Roman meal, in the modest apartment and the gleaming triclinium both, there is a smell that ties them together. It is garum. Garum is a fermented fish sauce made by layering fish, often small fish like mackerel or anchovies, with salt in large clay vessels, leaving them in the sun for weeks or months, letting the mixture break down slowly until the liquid that is drawn off is dark and intensely savory, something with a depth that is difficult to describe without tasting it. It is not subtle, but neither is it simply fishy in a raw or unpleasant way. It is complex, and Romans use it the way later centuries will use salt, the way still later centuries will use soy sauce or Worcestershire as the thing added to nearly everything, the background note that makes other flavors come forward. Garum arrives at the table in small ceramic bottles or bowls. It goes into the cooking, into the sauces, into the dressings for vegetables. The smell of it is part of the smell of Rome itself, woven into the city's kitchens and markets, into the docks where the amphorae arrive sealed with stoppers of clay or cork, labeled with their contents and sometimes their quality. Some garum is expensive and fine, made from choice fish, aged carefully, traded across the whole Mediterranean world. Some is cheaper and rougher, available to anyone with a few coins. But garum of some kind finds its way onto almost every Roman table. The cookbooks that survive from this period, and there is one, the compilation attributed to Apicius, its recipes reaching us across nearly 2,000 years, call for garum constantly. It appears in meat dishes and fish dishes and vegetable dishes, in sauces poured hot over roasted meats, in cold dressings for lettuce and cucumber. A Roman meal without garum is almost unimaginable. It is the flavor of the era, the way a certain smell or taste can carry an entire world within it. And now the meal is finished. In the modest apartment, the pot is scraped clean, the bread is gone, the lamp is burning low. The family arranges itself for the evening, the children perhaps already asleep, the adults sitting in a kind of pleasant stillness. The brazier gives off a small warmth. Outside, the street sounds have softened, though they have not disappeared entirely. There are still voices somewhere, still the movement of the city settling into its nighttime character. But in this room, there is a quietness that feels earned. In the wealthy house, the final course has been cleared, and if there is to be a conversatio, a drinking session after the meal, it may be beginning now. More wine, perhaps some music, conversation that becomes less formal as the evening lengthens. Or perhaps the guests are rising, gathering their sandals from beside the couches, calling for their lamps, sending messages ahead to their own households that they are on their way. The host remains in the room as they leave. The slaves move through the house, extinguishing some lights, carrying others, tending to what still needs tending. Across Rome, in hundreds and thousands of households, this same slow settling is happening all at once, though none of them know or think about the others. Each household is its own small world in this hour, after eating, enclosed by its walls and its lamplight, the smell of the meal still present in the air, the warmth of food still in the body. The city is not silent. It will never be entirely silent. But the evening meal has done what it always does in this city and in every city, in this century and in every century. It has gathered people together against the coming dark, filled them, and left them quieter than they were before. And now the lamps are lit. Across the city, in every apartment and in every house, in every back room of every tavern and workshop still holding a few last customers, the oil lamps have been filled and trimmed and set alight. They are small things, most of them. Fired clay, shaped like a shallow leaf or a slightly flattened oval, with a narrow channel for the wick and a small opening on top where the olive oil is poured in. Some are plain and unadorned, the kind sold cheaply from stalls near the Forum. Others carry a little molded image on their surface, a dolphin, a gladiator, a face of the sun god, pressed into the clay before firing, worn smooth now by years of careful handling. The light they give is warm, deeply warm, not the clear white brightness of daylight, not even the pale gray of a cloudy afternoon, but something amber and alive, something that moves very slightly with the air in the room. In a third-floor apartment along one of the long streets behind the Circus Maximus, a single lamp sits on a wooden shelf near the window. Its flame bends and steadies, bends and steadies. The room it lights is small, a sleeping room really, with a narrow mattress stuffed with wool, a wooden chest pushed against one wall, a clay jar of water sitting in the corner. The plaster walls were painted once, long ago, in a soft ochre yellow, and in this lamplight they seem to glow very faintly from within, as though the warmth is coming from the walls themselves rather than from the flame. The shadows here are not sharp or alarming. They are soft, and they move slowly. When the flame bends, a shadow along the far wall shifts and stretches, and then it comes back again and settles. This is what Roman lamplight does to a room. It makes everything feel a little closer, a little gentler. The terracotta tiles underfoot, the rough plaster above, the hanging cloth that serves as a door, they all take on the same amber quality, the same muffled depth. Colors that would be distinct and separate in daylight, the red stripe on a folded garment, the pale gray of limestone dust on a windowsill. All of them soften now into the same quiet warmth. There's also, it must be said, a faint smell. Olive oil burning is not unpleasant. It carries a thin, slightly grassy scent, somewhere between kitchen and orchard. But in a closed room, with the lamp burning for several hours, it gathers. It settles into fabric and hair. It is simply the smell of Roman interior nights, as ordinary and unremarkable to the people living here as the smell of their own bread or their own wool. Richer households burn better oil. Poorer ones make do with what they can afford, and sometimes that means a slightly smokier flame, a slightly thicker trail rising in a dark thread toward the ceiling. Over years, ceilings in occupied apartments turn a deep sooty gray near the lamp corners, a quiet record of every night that has ever been lit inside these walls. In the atrium of a larger house somewhere on the slope of the Palatine Hill, the lamplight falls differently. There are several lamps here, arranged on a tall iron stand in the central room, and their combined light reaches further, touches more. It catches the edge of a small marble table, the lip of a bronze basin, the surface of the impluvium, that shallow pool set into the floor to collect rainwater from the open square in the roof above. The water in the impluvium lies still and dark tonight, and it holds a small, soft reflection of the lamps, like something far away and very quiet. Along one wall of this atrium, and in the corridor beyond, there is a lararium, a household shrine. Most Roman families have one, fitted into a niche in the wall or built out slightly into the room, painted with figures of the Lares, the protective spirits of the household, shown as small dancing figures, togaed, holding drinking horns. Beside them, sometimes, a figure of the genius, the animating spirit of the head of the family. And at the base of the shrine, on a little ledge, the daily offerings. Tonight, as on most nights, someone has left a small piece of bread there, torn from the evening's loaf, placed carefully. A pinch of incense burns in a tiny clay vessel, sending a thin curl of pale smoke upward. The incense is not expensive, something resinous and slightly sweet, frankincense perhaps, or something close to it, purchased from a small shop near the Temple of Isis in the southern part of the city. Its smoke drifts up and disperses into the room's warm air, and the lamplight catches it very briefly as it passes through the flame's small halo, making it visible for just a moment before it is gone. These shrines are tended every day. The offerings are small and frequent rather than grand and occasional. A piece of bread, a few drops of wine poured from a jug. On the kalends, the first day of the month, and on other significant days, perhaps garlands of flowers or a small honey cake. This is not a formal or ceremonial religion in the domestic setting. It is more like a quiet daily acknowledgement, the way one might pause at a familiar threshold before passing through. An unhurried moment. Then back to the evening. The painted plaster of the shrine's niche has been touched many times over the years. The fingers that have placed offerings there, the breath from faces bent close to light a small lamp or adjust an offering, the accumulating warmth of years of mornings and evenings. All of it has left the paint slightly soft in places, slightly darkened at the edges of the figures. The dancing Lares are still recognizable, still vivid in their red and yellow and pale ochre. But they have a softness now, a worn quality that makes them seem more like companions than icons. Outside, the city is not entirely dark. On a wider street, running from the Forum toward the Esquiline Hill, a small procession moves through the night. A wealthy citizen returning late from a dinner engagement. A man in a fine dark wool toga, walking at a measured pace, is accompanied by several slaves carrying torches. The torches are resinous and bright, burning with a slightly orange, slightly smoky light that is altogether different from the quiet amber of the oil lamps indoors. This outdoor light is larger, more assertive. It pushes the darkness back several feet in every direction, and the shadows it casts are longer and more dramatic, swinging outward as the procession moves, then swinging back. This is how wealthy Romans travel at night, not alone and not in darkness. The torchbearers walk ahead and beside, and the circle of light moves with them like a small island through the dark street. At certain corners, particularly near temples, and at major intersections where streets open up slightly, there are iron brackets fixed into the stone of the wall, and from these brackets hang oil lanterns. They are enclosed, these lanterns, small iron frames with panels of scraped animal membrane stretched thin enough to let the light through, or sometimes thin sheets of horn, slightly translucent, slightly amber in color. The light that comes through these panels is filtered, muffled, a very gentle diffusion rather than a direct flame. It does not illuminate much. A few feet of pavement, the beginning of a doorway, enough to suggest where a corner is, where a step drops away. The city has no system of street lighting in any organized sense. These lanterns exist because someone, a temple, a guild, a wealthy resident who has donated to the neighborhood, has placed and maintained them. They are scattered and irregular. Between them, the streets are genuinely dark, but sound still travels, even in darkness. From somewhere up a narrow alley, a dog settles itself and is quiet. The distant sound of water moving through one of the city's many lead pipes, finding its way from the aqueduct channels down through the walls of buildings, carries a low, continuous murmur that is always present in Rome at night, so constant that it has long since ceased to be noticed by anyone who lives here. It is simply part of the night's texture. The water moves, the walls carry its sound, and the city breathes around it. Back in the small apartment on the third floor, the lamp on the shelf has burned perhaps a quarter of its oil. It will last the night if the flame stays small. The walls glow their soft ochre. The shadows settle. The smell of oil and warm plaster and old wool fills the room with a familiar closeness, the closeness of a space that has been lived in, breathed in, slept in for many years by many people. The flame bends very slightly. Then it straightens and is still. Somewhere in the Aventine district, on a night like most other nights, a small group of men is moving slowly through the dark streets. There are perhaps 6 or 7 of them walking together, and they move without urgency. Their sandals make a soft, familiar sound against the stone, a scuffing, unhurried rhythm that has become second nature after many months of this work. One of them carries a long wooden pole. Another has a heavy bucket hanging from each hand, and every few steps he shifts them slightly, redistributing the weight, because the buckets have been heavy since before he can properly remember. Someone near the back of the group yawns, not bothering to cover it. There is no reason to be formal. The night is quiet, and they have been awake for several hours already. These men are vigils. That word in Latin simply means watchers, or those who stay awake. It is a plain name for a plain kind of work. Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era maintained 7 cohorts of these men, spread across the 14 administrative regions into which the city had been divided. Each cohort was responsible for 2 regions, and they worked through the night in rotating groups, walking their assigned districts from dusk to dawn. The vigils were not soldiers, though they had a loose military organization. They were something closer to a public service, men employed by the state to keep the city safe while most of its inhabitants slept. Their responsibilities had 2 main shapes. The first was fire. Rome was a city of extraordinary density, where apartment buildings called insulae rose 4, 5, 6 stories or more, their wooden floors and walls packed close together, and where oil lamps burned in nearly every room through the night. Fire was never far from anyone's thoughts. The vigils carried pumps and hooks and buckets of water and vinegar and sand, and they knew which buildings had cisterns nearby, and they were trained to move quickly when moving quickly was called for. The second shape of their work was a kind of quiet policing, watching for unusual movement, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, making sure the streets remained orderly in those long hours when the magistrates and the courts and the ordinary mechanisms of civic life were all at rest. But tonight, in the Aventine, there is nothing urgent to attend to. The group moves along one of the district's sloping streets, past the dark fronts of closed tabernae, past the high windowless walls of warehouses that store grain and olive oil during the day. The Aventine was a residential district by this period, home to many ordinary working people of Rome, and at this hour its streets have the particular stillness of a place that has finished its day and settled itself for sleep. The buildings here are mostly brick and concrete, the older timber structures having given way over time to sturdier materials after the great fires that had periodically reshaped the city. The vigils, walking through, know this district the way anyone knows a familiar route, not consciously, not with deliberate attention, but in the way the body knows where to step without asking the mind. One of the men pauses for a moment and tilts his head slightly, and for a second or two the whole group slows. Then he shakes his head. It was nothing. Perhaps a cat on a rooftop, or the sound of someone turning in their sleep behind a high window. They move on. The vigils carried something called a clepsydra on their patrols, a simple water clock that measured the passage of time through the slow movement of water from one vessel to another. It helped them mark their progress through the night watch, which was divided into formal segments. But a man who has spent enough nights walking the same streets begins to feel time differently, through the temperature of the air, through the sounds the city makes or stops making, through the angle at which darkness seems to rest against the buildings. Experience becomes its own kind of clock. Somewhere above them, in one of the upper apartments of a tall insula, a lamp is still burning. Its light shows faintly at the edge of a small high window, a thin warm line in the darkness. Perhaps someone is reading, or an infant has woken, and a mother is sitting with it in the lamplight, waiting for sleep to come back. The vigils do not look up for long. A burning lamp behind a wall is not a concern. A burning lamp that has fallen, that has spread its small flame to a curtain or a pile of cloth or a wooden beam. That is what they are listening for, that particular sound, that smell, that quality of warmth where warmth should not be. They turn a corner and descend a few steps where the street drops sharply toward a lower level of the hill. One of the men with the buckets lets them down for a moment, resting his arms. He breathes slowly. No one says anything about it. There is an easy companionship In this kind of work, the companionship of people who have spent many hours together in the dark doing something that doesn't require much conversation. Words are exchanged when something needs to be said, and the rest of the time there is simply the shared fact of being awake together in a sleeping city. It is worth pausing here for a moment to think about what the vigils were wearing and carrying, because the details have a certain quiet plainness to them. They wore a standard tunic, likely of undyed wool, practical and unremarkable. Over this, on cold nights, a heavier cloak. Their sandals were sturdy working footwear, built for long hours on stone. They carried the buckets already mentioned, and also poles called insulae, long hooks used to pull burning timber away from walls or to break apart sections of a burning structure so that the fire could not travel further. They had hand pumps called sipho that could force water with some pressure onto a fire. They carried matting soaked in water or vinegar that could be pressed against a flame. All of this equipment was distributed through the group, shared among the men, so that no single person carried everything. Night air on the Aventine has a slight coolness to it now, that particular quality of the small hours before dawn, when the stored warmth of the day has finally finished leaving the stone. A dog somewhere makes a brief, sleepy sound and goes quiet. The group moves along a wider street, past the entrance to a small courtyard where a fountain is running, the water flowing steadily as it flows through many of Rome's public fountains at all hours, because the aqueducts that feed the city do not stop at nightfall. The sound of the water is very gentle. One of the men slows slightly as they pass it and lets the sound follow him for a few more steps before the street turns and the fountain is behind them. Rome at night in these centuries was never completely silent, but it was quieter than the day in ways that the vigils understood well. During daylight hours, the city was dense with sound, the calls of vendors, the creak of cart axles, the noise of construction, voices layered over voices in a city of perhaps 1 million people pressed into a relatively small area. At night, much of that lifted. The carts came through in the dark hours because wheeled traffic was largely banned from the city center during the day. And so, the rumble of iron-rimmed wheels over basalt stone was a familiar sound of the night hours. The vigils listened for it, not because it was alarming, but because it was one of the many ordinary textures of the night they had learned to hear around and through. One of the men says something quietly, and another one makes a low sound of agreement. It is probably nothing of great consequence, a remark about the cold, or about how long until their relief comes, or simply the kind of observation that surfaces when people have been walking in silence for a while. The words drift away into the dark without needing to be remembered. The group continues along the Aventine Street, unhurried, moving through a city that is breathing quietly all around them. The buildings stand close on either side. The stars, where they are visible above the rooftops, are clear and still. Somewhere a few streets away there is the distant sound of a cartwheel crossing an uneven section of paving, a brief, irregular clatter that smooths back out into silence. The vigils hear it and continue walking. Nothing is on fire. The night is calm. The heavy buckets swing gently with each step, the water inside them making its small, patient sound against the wood. The cobblestones pass slowly underfoot, one after another, as they have all night, as they will for another few hours yet, until the darkness begins to soften at its edges, and the city begins, very slowly, to wake. And now, out beyond the city's quieter districts, along the wide roads that lead into Rome from every direction, something is moving. It has been moving for a while now. Since well before the last of the evening light faded from the sky, the roads outside Rome began to fill, not with people on foot, not with the ordinary traffic of a busy city, but with carts. Heavy, slow, deliberate carts, drawn by oxen whose breath rises in soft clouds in the cooler night air. Carts loaded with timber and stone, with barrels of wine sealed with pitch and stoppered tight, with enormous sacks of grain that have traveled from the farms and ports and warehouses of the wider world. All of it moving now, steadily, toward Rome. There is a law behind this movement. Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries has a rule, a practical and very necessary rule, that heavy-wheeled vehicles may not use the city's streets during daylight hours. The streets are simply too narrow, too crowded, too full of people going about their ordinary lives. A cart loaded with building stone moving through the forum would bring everything to a standstill. It would block the colonnades and the porticos and the spaces where merchants lay out their wares and where children run between the feet of slow-moving adults. And so the law says no. The carts must wait. They wait outside the city gates, or they travel slowly toward the city through the morning and the afternoon, timing their arrival so that when darkness falls and the rule lifts, they are ready. They move in when the streets empty. They move in when the night properly begins. The sound of this arrival is one of the most characteristic sounds of a Roman night. Juvenal, the satirist writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, complained about it with some feeling. He wrote about the noise of the city at night, the impossible sleep, the racket of wagons on the stones. It is not a gentle sound. The wheels of a heavy cart, iron-rimmed, rolling over the irregular surface of Roman cobblestones, make a grinding, clattering, resonant noise that carries a long way through the still night air. The oxen move slowly, but they are large animals, and their hooves strike the stone with a steady, heavy rhythm. The drivers call out occasionally, low instructions that echo off the walls of the apartment blocks on either side. And yet, there is something about this noise that is not quite disturbing, or at least not only disturbing. It is a very old sound. Rome has been absorbing the nighttime arrival of its supply carts for generations, for centuries. The people who sleep in the apartments above, the ones who are not awoken by it, the ones who have lived here long enough, they know this sound the way you know the sound of rain on a roof. It is the sound of the city being fed, being resupplied, being kept in working order. It is a sound that means tomorrow will be much like today. There is timber tonight, coming in on a series of long, flat wagons, the wood stacked and lashed with rope. Timber is always in demand in Rome. Buildings go up constantly. Scaffolding rises and falls, and when fires occur, and they do occur in a city of this density and this age, there is always rebuilding. The timber comes from the forests of central Italy, from the mountains to the north and east, and it arrives in Rome already rough cut and sorted. The men who unload it will work quickly in the early morning hours, stacking the wood in the yards of the merchants who deal in such things. There is stone too, though stone moves more slowly still. The great building programs of the emperors and the private construction that fills in around them require an unending supply of tufa and travertine, and marble in varying grades. The stone that comes in tonight is not the fine-grained marble of the grander monuments. It is working stone, practical stone, the kind that forms the cores of walls and the surfaces of ordinary streets. It sits on the carts with enormous patience, as stone always does, having already waited millions of years to be quarried, and now waiting a few more hours to be unloaded. Wine is different in character. Wine arrives in large ceramic amphorae, sealed and labeled, stacked carefully in the bodies of the carts with straw between them to stop the jars from knocking against each other. Some of this wine has come from the vineyards south of Rome, from the Alban Hills or the Campanian coast. Some has come from further, from the islands or from Spain or from the eastern provinces, transferring from ship to cart at Ostia, and making the last stage of its journey on the road along the Tiber. The amphorae are heavy and awkward to handle, and the men who work with them are practiced in the particular art of moving large ceramic jars without breaking them. But the grain is perhaps the most important cargo of all. Rome feeds millions of people. The exact number is debated still, but the city is vast and its population extraordinary for this period of history. The grain that feeds them comes primarily from Egypt and North Africa, arriving at Ostia and Portus by ship, transferred to barges that move up the Tiber, then loaded onto carts for the final journey into the city itself. The system is so elaborate and so essential that the emperors treat it as a matter of the highest importance. An interruption in the grain supply is a crisis of the gravest kind. And so the grain moves, night after night, in its sacks, on its carts, along the roads, into the city, into the warehouses that will distribute it onward, on the road into night, somewhere along the Via Appia or the Via Ascensis, or one of the other great arteries that converge on Rome. A driver has paused to let his oxen rest. This is not unusual. The oxen are strong, but they tire, and a good driver knows that a slow and steady arrival is better than arriving with exhausted animals who have nothing left. He sits on the edge of his cart, and he can see Rome ahead of him, the glow of it against the dark sky, the way a large city always gathers light above it. Oil lamps in 1,000 windows, fires burning in 100 kitchen hearths, torches at the gates and the major crossings. Rome glows warmly in the distance, enormous and patient and waiting. He will be inside the gates within the hour. He has done this many times. In the streets themselves, the first of the night's carts are already making their way through. The sound of them moves through the city in waves, rising and fading as the wagons turn corners and enter different districts. On the upper floors of the apartment blocks, the insulae that rise 4 and 5 and 6 stories above the street, some people do sleep through it. They are used to it. The sound has been part of their nights for as long as they have lived here, and the mind learns to incorporate a familiar sound into sleep the way it incorporates the sound of breathing. The slow settling of a building in the cool hours. Others lie awake and listen, not with irritation necessarily, or not only with irritation. There is something almost comforting about the knowledge that below you, in the dark streets, the work of keeping the city alive is going on. The grain is arriving. The wine is arriving. The timber and stone that will keep buildings standing and new ones rising are arriving. Rome is being tended, even now, even in the dark hours. The carter on the road checks his load one more time, something he does from habit more than necessity. The sacks are tied. The rope is sound. The oxen have rested enough. He stands up, settles himself back on the board, and makes the small sounds that get the animals moving again. Slowly, in the way that everything moves at night, they begin again toward the gates. The wheels turn. The iron rims find the stone road, and the sound begins again. That grinding, rolling, resonant sound that Juvenal complained of, and that 1,000 drivers before him had made on these same roads, on roads that ran through Rome long before Juvenal was born, and would run through it long after. The city receives the carts the way it always has. The gates are open. The streets are waiting. The night is not silent. It has never been quite silent in Rome, but it is inhabited, and this is different from silence. And in its own way, it is a kind of rest. The carts move through the dark city slowly, steadily, carrying what is needed, going where they are going. And the night settles around them like something ordinary and good. The insula stands close to the Tiber, the way so many of them do, rising up from a narrow street that is barely wider than a cart. It is a tall building by the standards of any age before our own, 4 stories, perhaps nearly 5, the upper levels corbelling slightly outward over the lane below. The whole structure made of brick and timber and good Roman concrete, layered and stacked and settled into itself over the decades. Buildings like this one house most of the city. Most Romans do not live in grand houses with atrium courtyards and mosaic floors. They live here in rooms that are rented by the year or the month, or sometimes by the week, stacked one above the other like honeycombs, each cell warm with the particular warmth of whatever family or solitary person has made it theirs. The street outside is still moving. There are carts out there in the darkness, the familiar groan of iron-bound wheels, the slow breath of oxen. But the sound comes from a distance now, filtered through thick walls, and inside the insula it becomes something softer, a low vibration that the building absorbs without complaint. The walls have heard this for years. The floors have felt it. It has become, over time, simply the texture of the night. On the ground floor, there is a shop. During the day, it sold perhaps bread, perhaps oil, perhaps small clay amphorae of ordinary wine, the kind of modest commerce that fills the street-level spaces of most insulae in the city. The wooden shutters are down and barred across the front now, heavy planks slotted into iron brackets, and behind them, the shop is quiet and dim. The owner sleeps in the back, on a pallet on the floor beside his counter, his cloak pulled up around his shoulders. He has no separate room. The shop is where he works and where he rests, and the line between those two things has long since ceased to trouble him. He sleeps on his side, breathing slowly, and the smell of the day, bread and grain, and the faint sharpness of olive oil still lingers in the air around him. It is a comfortable smell, a working smell, and it seems to settle more deeply into everything as the night grows quieter. There's a staircase at the back of the building, narrow and steep, worn smooth in the center of each step by years of feet. It does not have a railing in the modern sense, just a wall on each side close enough to touch. The walls are plastered, and the plaster is marked at shoulder height with the pale smudges of countless hands finding their way up and down in the dark. People know this staircase by feel, by the slight creak of the third step, the way the fourth step gives just a little more than it should. No one needs a lamp to climb it at this hour. They have made the journey too many times. The second floor opens onto a small landing. There are 2 rooms here, separated by a thin partition wall, and one of them belongs to a family. A husband and wife and 2 young children share this space, which is not large, perhaps as much as a single modest room in any of the buildings that line a quiet street today, perhaps a little less. They have arranged it carefully. There is a bed on one side, a low table, a few wooden boxes that serve as storage and occasionally as seating. Against the far wall, a small bronze brazier sits on a tile base, its coals banked down for the night, still giving off a gentle warmth that has spread through the room and gathered in the corners. The children sleep on a pallet near the brazier. One of them has kicked off a blanket, arm flung out with the total confidence of a sleeping child, hand open, fingers relaxed. The other is curled tight, knees drawn up. The parents are asleep too, the wife closer to the wall, the husband on the outside edge of the bed, one arm hanging down. The room is warm, warmer than the street, warmer than the upper floors. And this warmth is one of the reasons the ground and second floors are more desirable, more expensive. Warmth is work. Someone has to tend a fire to produce it, and the family on the second floor has done that work this evening and is sleeping now inside the result of it. The brazier ticks occasionally, a small metallic sound as the metal cools, and the coals breathe a faint reddish light that moves almost imperceptibly across the ceiling. So slowly, it seems not to move at all. Somewhere below, a cart passes on the street, and the building takes the vibration lightly, easily, the way an old tree takes a wind it has felt 1,000 times before. The stairs continue upward. The third floor is cooler. The rooms here cost a little less than the rooms below, and they are perhaps a little smaller, or feel smaller, because there is more sky above them and less warmth rising from the floors beneath. A woman lives in one of these rooms, alone, which is unusual enough to suggest something about her particular circumstances. A widow, perhaps, or a woman who has come to Rome from somewhere else and made a life here by herself. She has a small oil lamp that burns on a ledge near the door, a flame so small it barely deserves the name, just a thread of light that keeps the absolute dark from settling in. Her breathing is slow and even. The lamp burns on. Next to her room, behind a door that does not quite fit its frame anymore, a space that might have been a storage room at some point has been made habitable in the modest way that poverty makes spaces habitable. A pallet, a folded blanket used as a pillow, a clay pot in the corner. The man who lives here has come from one of the towns of Campania, down in the south, a place of fertile fields and slower rhythms. And he has been in Rome for perhaps 2 years, working at the docks near the river, carrying sacks and bales, and the heavy merchandise of a city that imports nearly everything it consumes. He is a large man, built for carrying weight, and he sleeps with the depth of someone whose body has worked hard today and yesterday and the day before, a sleep without dreams, or at least without any dreams that trouble the surface. He snores softly, not loudly, not in a way that carries through the wall, just a quiet, regular sound that is almost a rhythm, almost something to sleep alongside. The fourth floor, the highest, is where the building feels most like itself. Up here the walls are a little thinner. The street sounds, which have faded on the lower floors, come back in a different form on the fourth, not as vibration, but as sound, the actual voices of the city at night, the distant call of someone moving through a lane below, the creak of a sign or a shutter somewhere down the block. The wind, when there is wind, is felt here in a way it is not felt on the second floor. A single room at the front of the building on this level is occupied by a young man, a student perhaps, or a copyist, someone whose occupation involves sitting still and handling words. There are small clay tablets stacked carefully near the wall, and a writing case, and a cloak hung on a peg above the bed. He sleeps on his back, one hand on his chest, his face open and untroubled. He has pushed the shutter open just slightly, the way young people sometimes do even in cool weather, drawn to the outside air. And through the gap the night comes in, a thread of river smell. The distant, ordinary sounds of the city continuing its nighttime work far below. A suggestion of sky that is dark blue rather than black now, which means nothing yet, which is still hours before any lightening toward dawn. The building settles. Buildings like this one are always settling, the timber floors shifting a little as the temperature changes, the brick expanding and contracting with the slow breath of the seasons. It is not an alarming sound when you know it. It is simply the sound of a structure at rest, making the small adjustments that structures make. The people inside have long since stopped hearing it as a sound at all. And then from somewhere on the second floor, from the room with the brazier and the two sleeping children, there is a small sound. A baby stir, perhaps, or the elder child rolling over, or simply the sound of a body adjusting in sleep, the unconscious shift of a person who is dreaming and moving very slightly with whatever the dream holds. The sound rises up through the stairwell, faint and brief, and then it stops. The building is quiet. Everyone is still. The cart sounds outside have moved further down the road, toward the river, and in their wake, the insula sits wrapped in the deepest part of the night, all its floors breathing together, all its lives stacked one above the other in the warm and ordinary dark. Somewhere below the sleeping city, water moves. It has been moving all night, and all the nights before this one, running through channels carved from stone and sealed with a particular kind of Roman mortar, a mortar so dense and so carefully made that it has barely let a drop escape in 100 years. The water does not know that the city is sleeping. It does not slow for the hour. It simply continues, as it has always continued, following the gentle, almost imperceptible downward slope that the engineers calculated so carefully, so many decades ago, guiding the water from the hills and springs far outside the city all the way to the streets and basins of Rome. There were, by this period, several great aqueducts bringing water into the city. The Aqua Claudia was one of the grandest, begun under Caligula and completed under Claudius, its arches rising high above the ground on the southern approach to Rome, carrying cold, clear water from springs in the Cimbruine hills, nearly 70 miles away. At this hour, those arches are pale against the dark sky, the water inside them invisible, but present, moving quietly. The arch forms are enormous and unhurried, each one bearing the same still loaded bore yesterday and will bear tomorrow. On the streets below, the sound of that water becomes something else entirely. It arrives softened, distributed, divided among the pipes and channels that branch from the main supply. Some of that water goes to the great public baths, which have their own storage cisterns. Some goes to private households wealthy enough to have paid for a connection. But much of it flows, steadily and without interruption, into the public fountains, the simple stone basins that stand at street corners and crossroads throughout the city, low enough for anyone to reach, always overflowing, always spilling a thin, constant sheet of water down over the rim and into a shallow channel cut into the street. There is one of these fountains near the base of a narrow alley, not far from where the insula stands. In daylight, it is a busy place, people carrying amphorae, filling jugs, letting children splash their faces in the heat. But at this hour, it is entirely alone. The The water comes out of a carved stone face, a simple spout, and it falls into the basin with a sound that seems, in the quiet, almost musical. Not loud, not dramatic, just a steady, soft percussion. The water falling a short distance onto the surface below, and the basin overflowing at its lower edge, and the overflow disappearing into the street channel. The moonlight, where it finds the water, makes it briefly silver. The surface of the basin is never still. There is always movement, always the faint rings expanding from the point where the spout strikes, always the gentle trembling of the overflow. But the sound is constant enough that the people who live nearby have long since stopped hearing it. It has become part of the texture of the night, something the ear accepts without comment, the way it accepts the sound of breathing. These street fountains were called nymphea in their more elaborate forms, named for the water nymphs of older belief. The simpler versions were just basins, just spouts, but the association with something older and quieter than the city's daily business lingered in the word. Water had always felt like something apart from ordinary things. It came from far away, from springs and hillsides, and places the city dwellers had never seen. And it arrived already cold, already clean, carrying something of those distant origins with it. The lead pipes that distributed water through the city were marked with inscriptions. The name of the emperor, the name of the official who had overseen the installation, sometimes the diameter of the pipe, stamped into the soft metal before it cooled. These markings allowed the water inspectors to know which pipe belonged to which supply, which household was drawing what quantity. There were regulations about how much water a private user could divert, and there were people employed to check that those regulations were followed. But at this hour, the pipes simply carry their water in silence, and the regulations are sleeping along with everything else. The men who maintained the aqueducts did not always sleep when the city slept. There was a permanent staff, slaves and freedmen employed by the Imperial Water Authority, who walked the channels regularly, checking for problems. On the open portions of the aqueduct, the specus, the covered channel that ran along the top of the arched structure, a person with a torch could move slowly through the darkness, listening. The sound of water in a well-maintained channel is smooth and even rushing. The sound of water escaping through a crack is something different, sharper, more urgent, or sometimes barely audible at all. Just a faint change in the quality of the silence. A maintenance worker moving along the channel tonight would feel the stone beneath his feet slightly damp with condensation. The air inside the channel is cool and smells of minerals, of the particular cleanliness that cold, running water carries. The torch would not be bright enough to show much beyond the next few paces, but the ears are reliable in this darkness. The ears know the sound of water behaving as it should. Nights, the channel is untroubled. Most nights, the worker completes his section and returns to where he began without having found anything that needs attention. The Romans were skilled at this kind of construction, and the aqueducts, once built, were built to last. But vigilance was still part of the work. The city depended on this water absolutely. Without it, the baths would not function, the fountains would go dry, the daily rhythms of the city would change in ways that would be felt almost immediately. Down in the streets, a cat has found the edge of the fountain basin and is drinking. It laps carefully, with the particular economy of cats, and then sits for a moment watching the water continue to fall. Then it is gone, back into the darkness of the alley, and the fountain is alone again. There is a larger basin several streets away, a proper nymphaeum with a carved back wall and a small decorative figure, the water falling from a height into a wide pool. In daylight, this place is pleasant, a spot to pause, the sound of the falling water giving the corner a quality of peace that the busy street around it might otherwise lack. At this hour, the water falls into a pool that no one is watching, and the sound of it fills the small space between the buildings, as if it has always been the only sound in the world. Rome used an extraordinary amount of water. The various aqueducts together brought enough water into the city to supply every resident with a quantity that later centuries would consider remarkable water for drinking, for bathing, for the cooling of spaces, for the removal of waste through the sewer system, for the operation of mills, for the simple pleasure of fountains placed in public squares. The city had been built, in part, around its capacity to bring and distribute this water, and the water shaped the city in return. The cloaca maxima, the great sewer that drained the low-lying areas of the city, ran its dark course beneath the streets, and into it, eventually, came much of the water that had first arrived so cleanly from the mountains. The overflow from the fountains made its way through channels and drains down toward the Tiber. The river itself, broad and slow at this hour, received the city's drainage without comment and carried it south. But above all of this, the water in the aqueduct continues its unhurried progress. The springs in the hills that feed the Aqua Claudia are cold even in summer. By the time the water has traveled those many miles, it has changed only in having moved. It is still cold, still clear, still carrying the faint mineral quality of its source. It arrives at the city carrying something of the hills with it, something of the distance it has traveled, something that the city itself does not make and cannot manufacture. The sound at the street corner fountain is soft enough to sleep through. It has been soft enough to sleep through every night for generations. The water falling into the basin overflowing at its rim, the overflow running quietly into the channel cut into the stone. All of this continues, steady and undramatic, as the night moves through its darker hours, and the city rests in whatever rest it is capable of finding. The maintenance worker has finished his section of the channel and is resting somewhere in the darkness, his torch burning low. The cat has gone wherever cats go. The fountain continues its quiet work, and the water, indifferent to the hour and to the sleeping city around it, moves as it has always moved, carrying its cold mountain clarity all the way down to the stones of Rome. The Tiber is wide here, south of the Aventine Hill, and at this hour it is very dark. Not completely dark. There is always some light, the moon when it shows itself, the faint scatter of stars reflected loosely on the surface of the water, the occasional lamp burning on a barge moored for the night along the far bank. But the river absorbs light more than it returns it, and standing at the edge of the Emporium docks, looking out across the current, there is a sense of something vast and unhurried moving through the city without any particular interest in the city at all. The Tiber has been here longer than Rome, much longer. It came down from the Apennine Hills and found its way to the sea long before anyone thought to build walls on its banks, long before the first boats were dragged across its shallows. The Romans knew this, in the way that people who live close to rivers always know it, that the river is indifferent, that it has its own business, that it will be doing this long after the last stone of the city has settled into the mud. The smell reaches you before the sound. It is a particular smell, the smell of the Tiber at night, thick with mud and fish, and something older, something mineral and dark, that comes up from the riverbed where the current slows. There is rope in the smell too, old wet rope wound around the iron cleats along the dock edge, rope that has been soaking and drying and soaking again for years, until it has taken on a character of its own, half wood, half water, half something else entirely. The Emporium was Rome's great riverside warehouse district, stretching along the left bank south of the Aventine, and by day it was one of the loudest and most crowded places in the city. Ships came up from Ostia, the port at the river's mouth, some 15 miles downstream, laden with grain from Egypt and North Africa, with oil from Spain, with wine from across the Mediterranean, with marble and timber, and all the heavy freight of an empire. The unloading was constant, exhausting, noisy work, and the dockworkers who did it were among the most essential, least celebrated people in Rome. But the last unloading finished hours ago. The dockworkers have gone home, or gone to whatever dark corner of the city receives them for the night. The cranes that stood out over the water, long wooden arms with ropes and pulleys, are still now, their shapes just visible against the sky. The great covered warehouses behind the dock stand closed, their contents settled and quiet in the dark. What remains is the aftermath of the day's work. The amphorae stand in long rows along the dock, hundreds of them, tall clay vessels with pointed bases, each one sealed at the top with a clay stopper, or a plug of cork sealed with pitch. They hold olive oil, most likely, or wine, or the fish sauce called garum that the Romans used the way some people use salt, on nearly everything, in nearly every combination. The amphorae have been stacked in frames of wood and straw to keep them upright, and they wait in their rows with a kind of patient, unremarkable dignity, waiting for morning, waiting for the warehouses to open, waiting for the next part of their journey. Each amphora came from somewhere specific. The shape of it, the clay it was made from, the stamps pressed into its surface before firing. All of these things identified where it was made, who made it, what it held. An amphora of Spanish olive oil had traveled from a workshop in the hills of Baetica, been filled and sealed, loaded onto a ship at a southern port, carried across the Mediterranean, brought up the Tiber to this dock, unloaded by hand, and set down here. It might travel again in the morning, loaded onto a cart, and pulled through the streets to a shop or a warehouse or a wealthy household's kitchen. The amphora itself, once emptied, might be broken up and added to the great mound of ceramic shards that was slowly accumulating on the far side of the Aventine, the place that would later be known simply as the Mountain of Pots, a hill made entirely of broken amphorae, the residue of centuries of trade. But that is for another day. Tonight, the amphorae simply stand and wait. The watchman has settled himself on an upturned crate near the middle of the dock. He is not a young man, and he sits in the particular way of someone who has learned that the night is very long, and that it is better to be comfortable than to be vigilant, because vigilance burns through the hours badly and leaves you exhausted by midnight with most of the dark still ahead. He has a small fire near his feet, not a proper brazier, just a flat stone on which a few pieces of charcoal have been arranged, enough to take the edge off the damp air that comes off the river, enough to give him something to look at when the river itself offers nothing. He has a blanket across his knees. He has a cup of something warmed on the stone. He is not asleep, but he is not far from it either, and the line between watching and dreaming is a soft one at this hour. His job is presence more than action. The amphorae do not need guarding in any dramatic sense. What he prevents mostly is the casual opportunism of the very poor, the someone who might otherwise take a few handfuls of grain spilled from a torn sack, or try to work a stopper loose and fill a small vessel with oil. He is a deterrent made of firelight and proximity, and he is good at this particular kind of stillness. Out on the river, a light bobs slowly downstream. It is a barge, or the lamp on a barge. It is hard to tell from the dock which is which in the dark. The barge traffic on the Tiber ran at all hours because the city's needs did not pause, and because some things moved more easily by water than by road. This one is heading downstream toward Ostia, which means it is probably empty or nearly so, making the return journey after delivering whatever it carried upriver during the day. It moves without haste, helped along by the current, and its lamp draws a soft line of reflection on the water that widens and narrows as the river's surface shifts. The Romans called the Tiber the Flavus Tibris, the yellow Tiber, for the color of its water, which carried silt down from the hills and ran a dull ochre or brown for much of the year. At night, the color is invisible, replaced by the simple fact of darkness and motion. The river makes almost no sound against the stone embankment. Only a low, intermittent murmur, the sound of water moving against something solid, a soft percussion that repeats itself without pattern and without urgency, like the breathing of something very large and very calm. There are fish in the Tiber. There have always been fish in the Tiber, eels especially, and various freshwater species that the Romans caught and ate and complained about, because river fish were considered inferior to sea fish, which were themselves ranked in elaborate hierarchies of prestige and flavor. The eels of the Tiber were famous and were eaten regardless of any prejudice against freshwater things, because they were good and they were there. Under the dock, in the darkness between the stone pilings, the water moves in small, slow eddies. A fish moves through it, a dark shape in dark water, finning gently against the current, indifferent to the dock and the watchman and the rows of waiting amphorae above. It has been doing this all night, and will do it until dawn, and probably has no particular relationship with the concept of night at all. The watchman's fire burns low, and he feeds it another piece of charcoal without looking down, by feel, with the ease of long practice. The barge light is smaller now, farther downstream, still moving. The amphorae stand in their rows. The river moves against the stone with its low, barely there sound. The mud smell lifts slightly as the air shifts, some movement too subtle to call a breeze. And for a moment, the rope smell is stronger. And then the mud comes back, and then they settle into the usual mixture together. This is how the river is at night, wide and dark, and carrying its own quiet history through the middle of the city, under the bridges, past the docks and the warehouses and the sleeping hills, on its way to the sea. Not in a hurry, not particularly interested in anything on its banks, moving because that is what rivers do, following the old pull toward lower ground, the same pull it has followed since long before there was a city here at all. The watchman's head dips slightly, then lifts. His fire makes its small warmth. The water murmurs once, and then falls quiet, and then murmurs again. The forum is very still at this hour. The last of the night has settled into the stones, and the broad open space that fills with voices and footsteps, and the pressing of crowds through every waking hour, is now entirely quiet. The paving stones hold the cold of the small hours. A cat crosses somewhere near the edge of the rostra, stops, and then continues on its unhurried way into the shadow between two columns. Nothing else moves. This is perhaps the deepest hour of the night, that particular stretch that arrives some time before the sky shows any change at all, when the darkness seems to have been there forever, and the coming day feels like something still a long way off. The air is very cool. A faint smell of smoke drifts from somewhere, and the particular dry stone smell of the forum itself, which has its own quality, a kind of mineral stillness that the daytime noise covers over completely. Near the center of the forum, not far from the low roofline of the Regia, there is a small, round building. It is not large. It is modest almost compared to the great rectangular temples on the surrounding hills. Its circular walls are of white marble, and its roof rises in a gentle curve above them. This is the Temple of Vesta, and inside it, tended through all the hours of every night of every year, a fire is burning. The flame is small. It does not roar or leap. It does not cast great shadows across the walls. It burns quietly, with the particular steadiness of a fire that has been carefully managed, fed at the right intervals with the right kind of wood, protected from drafts and disturbance. The wood used comes from specific trees, chosen with attention. Oak was favored. The fire needs to be clean, continuous, without interruption. It has an almost meditative quality, a fire that burns because someone has ensured it will burn, and that someone has ensured it every day and every night for generations, beyond counting. The Romans understood this flame to be connected to the well-being of the city itself, not in a vague way, in a felt, immediate way. The fire represented something continuous and protected at the heart of Rome, something that had been burning since the founding of the city in the old stories, something that tied the present moment to all the accumulated past. To let it go out was a serious matter, a rupture in something that was supposed to be unbroken. It had gone out on rare occasions over the centuries, and those occasions were remembered with a kind of gravity that says something about how deeply the flame was held. The women who tended it were called the Vestals, the Vestal Virgins. There were 6 of them at any one time, and they served for 30 years. They were chosen in childhood, around the age of 6 to 10, from families of good standing. Their lives within the service were structured and careful. They lived in the building adjacent to the temple, the House of the Vestals, which was a substantial residence arranged around a central courtyard with a long reflecting pool and garden plantings. The house was comfortable and honored, and the women who lived there occupied a position of considerable respect in Roman society. Their duties included the tending of the flame, the preparation of a particular sacred substance made from the first cuttings of grain each harvest, certain ritual preparations for the major festivals of the Roman calendar, and the safekeeping of important documents and objects placed in their care by prominent Romans, including wills and treaties, because the Vestals were regarded as trustworthy beyond ordinary trust. At this hour before dawn, one of the Vestals would be present near the flame. The nighttime watch was a real watch. The fire could not be left entirely unattended. She would be dressed in her characteristic white robes, her hair arranged in the particular 6-braid style that marked the Vestals, a style that took its form from ancient tradition and had been maintained unchanged for as long as anyone could remember. She would move quietly. The space itself encourages quietness. The small fire gives light enough to see by, and the sound it makes is soft, a low, steady breath. She might add wood at certain intervals, placing it carefully, without disturbing the bed of coals beneath. The motion would be practiced and calm, the motion of someone who has done this hundreds of times, who knows the fire the way one knows something tended closely over years. There is a quality to that kind of knowledge that is hard to name. It is not dramatic knowledge. It is quiet and accumulated and very sure. Outside the temple, the forum is still empty. The stones of the Via Sacra, the sacred way that runs through the forum, and has been walked by priests and generals and ordinary Romans for centuries, are very pale in the darkness. The colonnades of the Basilica Aemilia stand in deep shadow to one side. The temples on the Capitoline Hill above are dark shapes against a dark sky. No lamps burn in the streets. No voices carry from any direction. The sky over the eastern edge of the city is not yet changing. It will change, but that change is still some time away. And for now, the darkness is complete and even. The stars are simply there, as they have been all night, and the quiet of the Forum seems to rise up toward them in some soft way, as if the stillness of the empty space and the stillness of the sky above are the same stillness, meeting without any boundary between them. There are other priests and temple attendants beginning to stir in Rome at this hour, in buildings scattered across the various hills and precincts of the city. The major temples had their own caretakers, their own morning preparations that began well before any light appeared. The opening of temple doors was a ritual act, done at a specific time and in a specific manner. The preparation of offerings, the lighting of altar fires, the arrangement of sacred implements, all of this had to be accomplished before the public hours of the temple began at dawn. So across the city, in the small darkness before that first gray, there are figures moving quietly through temple precincts with lamps and vessels, and the particular purposeful quietness of people engaged in old and familiar work. But here in the Forum, near the Temple of Vesta, the feeling is of an especially deep calm. The flame makes it so. A fire that has been burning for centuries, even with interruptions and renewals, accumulates a kind of weight in the imagination. To be near it in the stillness before dawn is to be near something very old and very patient. The city will wake around it in a few hours, as it has woken around it every morning for as long as the city has existed. The noise will return, the press of people, the voices in a dozen languages, the creak of cart wheels over stone, the smell of bread and smoke and animals, and people living close together. All of that will come. But for now, the Forum is simply empty and cool and quiet. The cat has gone. The paving stones hold their cold. The Temple of Vesta sits in the darkness with its small, steady fire, and the Vestal at her watch is still, and the flame neither hurries nor rests. The house of the Vestals lies just beside the temple, its long courtyard dark and still, the pool at its center reflecting whatever faint light the sky allows. The garden plants, rosemary perhaps, and other low-growing things, are still shapes in the darkness. The colonnade around the courtyard, with its statues of honored Vestals set in niches along the walls, stands in deep shadow. Those stone figures have their own stillness, a stillness made of marble rather than sleep, but a stillness that belongs to this hour nonetheless. The street outside, the narrow lane that runs behind the Regia toward the Palatine Hill, is entirely empty. The stones there are worn smooth by centuries of feet, the edges of the paving blocks rounded and low. A faint smell comes from somewhere, something herbal and dry, perhaps offerings prepared earlier in the evening. The small oil lamps that sometimes burn outside temple doors have long since guttered out or been extinguished by whatever attending hand was last there. Only the flame inside burns on. The sky over the Esquiline Hill, if one were to stand in the right place and look carefully toward the east, might show the very first, barely perceptible shift. Not light yet, not even the beginning of light, more a slight softening in the quality of the darkness there, a very faint and tentative easing, as if the night were becoming the smallest degree less dense at its far edge. It would be easy to miss. It would be easy to look and see nothing changed at all. But the change is beginning. Somewhere far below the horizon, the sun is beginning its long return, and the darkness that has held the city all night is beginning, without any hurry, to recede. The stones of the forum are still cold. The flame in the temple burns exactly as it has been burning. The night is not over yet. Somewhere in the deepest part of the night, while the vestal flame still burned in its quiet room, and the streets of the forum lay cool and empty under a sky that had not yet decided to become morning. A man named something like Marcus, or perhaps Gaius, some plain Roman name worn smooth by daily use, was already awake and already working. He had been awake for some time. This was simply the life of a pister, a baker in the city of Rome, and it had been the life of men like him for generations, so long that no one in the city would have thought to remark upon it. The bread was there in the morning because someone had been awake in the dark to make it so. That was all. That was the whole of it. The bakery sat not far from the Subura, that dense and lively quarter of the city that was, at this hour, as close to silent as it ever became. The building was low and solid, its walls thick enough to hold the heat of the oven through the long hours of the night. The doorway opened onto a narrow street, and the street was dark, and the darkness was very still. Inside, the oven had been burning for an hour already. It was a domed oven, built of clay and rubble and tile, rounded like a great sleeping tortoise set into the wall of the bakery. To heat such an oven properly took time. You built the fire inside it first, pushed the wood deep into the chamber, and let the flames do their slow, patient work on the clay itself, drawing the heat into the very substance of the walls, so that when the fire was eventually raked away and the bread went in, it was not just the air that was hot, but the whole rounded surface above and around it, radiating steadily, evenly, the way a stone holds the warmth of the sun long after the sun has moved on. The man with the flower-whitened arms was checking the temperature now. He did this by feel and experience, by the quality of the heat on his hand, held briefly near the mouth of the oven, by some inner accounting that had been built up over years of early mornings, just like this one. Rome had no thermometers. What it had was accumulated knowledge, passed from father to apprentice, a long, quiet chain of knowing stretching back further than anyone could say. The oven was ready, or very nearly so. While the oven came to its full heat, the work of grinding had been going on in the back of the building, and it had been going on for quite some time before the baking could begin, because flour does not arrive in a bakery already ground. The grain came in wheat or emmer wheat, or sometimes barley, stored in sacks or large ceramic jars. And before it could become bread, it had to pass through the mills. The mills of a Roman bakery were large and heavy, and shaped in a way that was quite distinctive. The lower stone was like a cone, wider at the base and tapering upward, and over it sat the upper millstone, which was hollow in the middle, so that it could rest on the lower cone and rotate around it. The grain was poured in through the opening at the top, worked its way down between the two grinding surfaces, and emerged as flour around the base. The stones were made of a particular volcanic rock, rough and hard, excellent for grinding without wearing too quickly. And the bakeries of Pompeii, that city south of Rome, whose ruins would one day preserve so much of this ordinary life in extraordinary detail, show clearly just how central these mills were to the work. And to turn the mills through the night, there were donkeys. This was simply how it was done in the bakeries of Rome. The animals were fitted with a wooden yoke or bar that connected them to the upper millstone, and they walked their slow circles in the back of the bakery, round and round, the stones grinding steadily, the flour accumulating in its pale drifts below. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work that found its way into poetry or official records. It was just the deep, continuous labor of the city feeding itself, happening in the dark before anyone else had opened their eyes. The donkeys moved without hurry, as animals that have done the same work many times will move, with a kind of settled patience. Their hooves made a soft, rhythmic sound on the stone floor. The millstones turned. The flour fell. Back at the oven, the man was preparing the dough that had been set to rise some hours earlier. Roman bread dough was leavened. Fermented starter was used to give it its rise, a method that had been known in the ancient Mediterranean for a very long time. Passed westward through the long migrations and exchanges of knowledge and practice that connected the cultures of Egypt and Greece and eventually Rome. The dough, when it was ready, had a weight and a living quality to it, slightly warm from its fermentation, soft and yielding under the hands. The loaves were shaped now, quickly, and with practiced ease. Roman bread came in particular forms, the round, scored loaf divided into portions by deep cuts across the top, so that it could be broken apart easily, the individual portions like petals around the center. Carbonized loaves have been found at Pompeii, their shapes preserved perfectly by the disaster that ended that city so abruptly. And they are immediately recognizable, those same round, divided loaves, as familiar in their way as anything from the ancient world, because they speak directly to the ordinary daily life of people who were hungry in the mornings, just as people are hungry in the mornings still. The loaves went onto the wooden peel, a long-handled flat paddle, not so different from the kind that bakers use today. And the baker slid them into the opened mouth of the oven with a practiced ease, a smooth, controlled motion that placed each loaf exactly where he wanted it on the hot floor of the chamber. Then the door of the oven was sealed, or nearly so, and the heat was left to do its work. The smell of baking bread began to move through the bakery. It is difficult to describe this smell in a way that does it full justice, because it is one of those smells that does not stay only in the nose, but seems to settle into the whole room, into the air and the walls and the spaces between things, warming them. It is ancient and domestic and deeply reassuring. The smell of something good being made from simple things, grain and water and time and heat. And it has been exactly this smell for as long as people have been baking bread in ovens, which is a very long time indeed. The baker moved quietly around the room. He prepared the next batch of dough. He attended to the oven. He checked on the donkeys, who continued their slow, patient circles without concern. There was a low lamp burning somewhere in the room, oil in a small clay vessel, its flame steady and small, casting a warm amber light across the flour dust that hung in the air and the pale surfaces of the unbaked loaves waiting their turn. Outside, the street was still dark. The city was still sleeping, or most of it was. Here and there across Rome, other bakeries were lit and working in just this same way. The same domed ovens, the same slow-turning millstones, the same men with flour on their arms, moving through the same quiet sequence of tasks that would culminate, in a few hours, in bread for the morning. The Romans were very fond of bread. It was a central food of the city, and the bread sold by the pistors was available to the vast majority of people who lived in the crowded apartment buildings of Rome, who had no means to bake for themselves, who relied on the bakeries as thoroughly as the city relied on its aqueducts and its streets. To walk through Rome in the morning was to walk through the smell of fresh bread drifting from open bakery windows. And that smell was one of the most ordinary and constant features of the city's daily life. But the smell required the night. The morning bread required these dark hours, this quiet work, this man with his peel and his oven and his slowly walking donkeys, attending to the long, unhurried processes that could not be rushed. The heat from the oven moved slowly outward through the room. The flour dust settled. The dough inside the sealed chamber rose and browned and became bread, as it had done every night before this, and would do every night to come, in this bakery near the Subura, in a city of perhaps 1,000,000 souls who would wake in the morning and find that the bread was simply there, as it always was, as if no one had needed to make it in the dark. And so the night begins, very slowly to end. It does not announce itself. There is no particular moment that can be pointed to, no clear line where dark becomes something else. It is more like a loosening, the way a held breath releases without quite deciding to. darkness, which has been absolute in the narrow streets between the insulae, begins to be merely deep, then merely dark. The shapes of things, a cart left against a wall, the corner of a fountain, the curve of an arch, begin to exist again, very faintly, as if the city is remembering itself from the inside out. This is the first gray light, and it comes to Rome the way it comes everywhere, without permission and without hurry. The hills feel it first. The Aventine, the Caelian, the long spine of the Esquiline, these higher places catch the earliest softening of the sky before any of it reaches the streets below. The ridgelines do not brighten so much as cease to be invisible. They become suggestions of themselves, dark masses against a darkness that is growing, very gradually, less complete. A traveler standing on the road outside the city walls might notice this before anyone inside the city does, might see the hills of Rome rise slowly out of the night, like something surfacing from deep water. Inside the walls, the streets are still quiet. The carts that were permitted to move through the night have been doing their slow work for hours, carrying timber and stone and amphorae of oil, and some of them are finishing their routes now, the drivers tired, the animals plodding with their heads low. Here and there, a cart turns off into a side street and stops. The driver climbs down. The animal stands still and breathes. In the Forum Romanum, the great open space that is the center of the city's public life, there is almost no one. The temples stand in their pale stone, the columns rising into air that is beginning, just barely, to hold a color that is not quite gray and not quite anything else. A single figure crosses the open ground, walking at the purposeful pace of someone who has somewhere to be, sandals brushing against the worn paving stones. Who this person is, where they are going at this hour, is not something the morning offers to explain. They cross the Forum and disappear into a street on the far side, and the Forum is empty again, and the columns stand in the soft, uncertain light, the way they have stood for years, for generations, without requiring the morning to be anything other than what it is. The sparrows notice before most people do. They have been in the eaves all night, tucked into the small spaces between roof tiles and the clay supports beneath, their feathers fluffed, their eyes closed. They wake in stages, not all at once. One bird shifts, another makes a small sound, a single syllable that is not quite a song. Then another. The process is unhurried, but it moves in only one direction. And within the space of a few minutes, what was a few isolated sounds in the darkness becomes a soft, general rustling. And calling from the roof lines of the Subura, from the eaves along the Tiber, from every quiet cornice and sheltered tile across the city, the sparrows of Rome are waking up, and they are not doing it quietly, but the sound they make is old and familiar, and requires nothing from anyone listening, just the way a river sounds, or rain, or any sound that has been present long enough to become part of the texture of a place. Somewhere near the market of the Forum Boreum, which sits close to the river and smells of cattle and old stone, even when the cattle are gone and the stalls are empty. A dog stretches in a doorway. It has been sleeping curled against the base of the door, taking some warmth from the wood. Now it extends its legs, opens its jaw wide, and settles again into a slightly different position, its chin on the threshold. The morning does not ask it to do otherwise. The first shopkeeper to unslot the panels from his doorway does it with the practiced ease of someone who has done the same motion thousands of times. The wooden boards come out one by one, each fitting into a groove, each lifted free and set to the side. This is how most Roman shops close for the night, not with a lock so much as with a series of fitted boards that slide into channels in the door frame, stacking snugly until the opening is filled. Removing them is quiet, methodical work. The boards go to one side, leaning against the wall. The shop opens, in this case a small workshop near the Argiltum, the area where booksellers and scribes tend to cluster. And the interior smell of wood shavings and ink, which has been sealed inside all night, drifts out into the street and mingles with the morning air. The smell of bread has been moving through certain alleyways for a little while already, rising from the bakeries that have been working through the deepest part of the night. It is a smell that needs no translation, that requires no particular knowledge or experience to understand. It is warm in a way that the morning air itself is not yet warm, and it carries with it the suggestion of something being ready, something completed. Near the Subura, where the bakery has had its oven burning and its dough rising, and its loaves sliding in and out of the clay dome for hours, the bread that was raw flour and water a short time ago is now golden and solid and smelling of itself in the unmistakable way that baked things smell. The pister, the baker, whose arms are still dusted with flour to the elbow, does not pause to observe this. He has done this enough times that the readiness of the bread is simply the next thing, following naturally from everything before it. He checks a loaf with the back of his hand, the way a person checks something familiar rather than something uncertain. He moves the finished rounds to a shelf near the front of the shop, where they will be visible from the street, where the morning's customers will begin to come soon, and the customers will come. Rome wakes in layers. The very early risers, those with reasons, those with roots, those whose work begins before most people's days have started, are already beginning to move. A water carrier fills an amphora at a public fountain, the sound of water filling a clay vessel, a clean, steady sound in the quiet. A woman with a basket crosses an intersection, her sandals certain on the uneven stones. Two men talk briefly at a corner, their voices low, the conversation efficient, and then they separate and go in different directions. The sky above the rooflines is changing in a way that can be noticed now without straining. It is gray, clearly gray, not the total absence of color that the middle of the night offers, but an actual color, soft, and even the kind of gray that holds within it the memory of what came before and the possibility of what comes next. The stars that were still visible an hour ago are mostly gone. A few of the brightest ones persist near the horizon, but they are fading, not dramatically, simply becoming less necessary as the sky does more of the work itself. The Tiber catches the light before the streets do. The river's surface reflects the sky above it, and the sky above it is slightly lighter than the sky above the rooftops, because there is nothing between the river and the open air. Looking down from the pons Emilius in these first gray minutes, the water is a soft pewter color, moving slowly, carrying the reflection of the bridge in long, wavering lines. A reed warbler makes a sound in the grasses near the bank. The river continues moving, the way it has been moving all night, the way it has been moving through all the nights of all the years of the city, carrying in its slow current the cold water from the mountains and the slow warmth of the valley, and eventually delivering all of it to the sea. The night is over, not because something ended it, but because everything that follows a night simply became, slowly, more present than the night itself. The warmth of the bread moving through the alleyways, the sparrows in the eaves, the shopkeeper setting his boards against the wall and standing for a moment in his open doorway, looking at the street. The Forum beginning to be a place where mourning happens rather than a place where darkness is kept. The hills finding themselves again above the roofline. This is how a gentle thing ends, not with a clear moment of ending, but by gradually becoming the next quiet thing. The darkness became gray. The gray will become, without hurry, something warmer, something that falls at a low angle across the stone columns and the worn paving and the river. Rome will be in full mourning before long, full of its noise and its crowds and its 10,000 daily necessities. But for now, just for this small, unguarded moment between one thing and the next, the city breathes. The bread is warm. The sparrows are calling. The light is soft and even, and the night has ended, as it always does, the way all gentle things end, simply by being, and then being over, and leaving in its place something ordinary and good.